All right, welcome everyone to our brown bag conversation on sustainability in Oakland with Daniel Hamilton. It's time to get going. My name is Joanna Gubman. I'm with Urban Environmentalists. And I just want to mention before we get going that we are recording this. And I think everybody's video is turned off, but if you would like to be more anonymous, just sign out and sign in again with an anonymous name. So I'll start off with a bit of an about us, because this is an actual, it's a co-hosted event between Urban Environmentalists and Young Professionals in Energy, two groups that I really care about. I used to be co-president of Young Professionals in Energy SF Bay Area in 2015, and now I'm a co-lead with Urban Environmentalists, so it's great to be having this event jointly. So Urban Environmentalist mission is to address the climate and inequality crises by transforming cities and towns into inclusive communities designed around people rather than cars. We value healthy communities and environments supportive of all life, vibrant, diverse, and nurturing urban communities with abundant housing and opportunities for all, and efficient, equitable use of our planet's resources, especially land. Young Professionals in Energy SF Bay Area is a local chapter of the global Young Professionals in Energy nonprofit, which includes over 40,000 members across 40 chapters. They facilitate the advancement of young professionals in the energy sector by providing opportunities for professional networking and knowledge sharing. YPE empowers its members to be leaders in their communities and the global energy industry through various event-oriented initiatives. And if you are not yet on their email list, I highly encourage you to get on it because they have tons of great events. So before we dive in, I just want to go through a few logistics. You'll notice at the bottom of your screen, there is a chat window that you can open up. And that's a place where feel free to have any side conversations you would like, as well as ask questions. So the second part of this event will be Q&A, and we'll be collecting those questions from that chat window. So for us to collect those questions, please just make it clear to us by prefacing your question with Q&A, and then your question, and then we'll collect it, and I'll be able to read some of those off to Daniel, and he'll answer your questions. So now let me introduce Daniel. Daniel Hamilton has served as a sustainability manager for the city of Oakland since 2014. He has more than 20 years of experience working with cities and public utilities to bring sustainability solutions to scale and supporting governmental innovation and adaptation to a changing world. So with that, let me hand it off to Daniel, and he's going to present some slides, and then we'll talk for a bit.
Thanks, Joanna, and welcome everybody. I'm glad to be here with you today. What I'd like to talk with you about today, what Joanna and I discussed on this, is the City of Oakland's Equitable Climate Action Plan. We are one of the few cities out there who believes, and I think this is a growing trend, but believes not only that equity is the foundation by which climate action strategies need to be developed, but part of that is the nomenclature, the words that we choose to use to describe how it is that we're going about addressing the climate crisis, whether it's simple things from global warming to climate change, or just the idea of stating upfront that the plan is an equity-driven plan, not because equity is a nice thing to include, but because addressing historical inequities and achieving balance within our society is in fact one of the reasons that we are saving the climate, or as I like to put it, we're not saving the climate for the owls, we're saving it for people. It's nice for the owls too, but most of what goes into things like city strategies are not really environmental in nature. They're social programs. They're designed to create livable cities that don't use more resources than they can provide back to the world. And this Equitable Climate Action Plan that I'm going to talk to you about today is Oakland's attempt to do this. So this is a plan that was developed over the past 18 months. You can see on the slide in front of you that social, racial, and economic equity are the drivers of the plan. They're the overarching principle under which all of the actions are designed. And we've broken it into two major parts in the plan itself. How do we slow down climate change? These are the mitigation strategies. And how do we adapt to climate change? These are the adaptation and resilience side of things. Climate action plans for cities in the past have primarily focused on the left side of your screen on how we slow down climate change mitigation strategies. these are important, but we can no longer really give second tier to resilience and adaptation, especially because the opportunities to do restorative justice around racial issues, around economic disparity issues, around other frontline and marginalized communities often fit on the right side of the screen. And doing justice to those and bringing people into the conversation really require equal treatment of these. So you'll see from the strategy we're going to talk about today, some of the boxes here show you the areas we focused on in dealing with those, but I'm going to get into some real detail about what both procedural and distributional equity mean in the city of Oakland. So let's move on to the next slide. So to start with, our ability to have real, true, engaged equity conversations in Oakland was based on a couple of things that we did over the years preceding this planning process. In essence, we wanted to know ahead of time, before we went into this, we wanted to be able to provide community members with good data about how we could reduce greenhouse gases. We needed to know not just that transportation systems needed to rely less on single occupant gas-powered vehicles and that buildings needed to use fewer fossil fuels. What we needed to know is what were the most cost-effective ways to do those things. Which priority mattered more? Does transportation matter more than buildings because transportation is a bigger side of the pie? Or maybe waste matters more because when you look at life cycle emissions from things like our waste streams and our consumption patterns, those can even trump transportation. So how do we balance these very disparate things against each other, and how do we provide the average person in our community the ability to engage in a useful conversation with that? For us, it involved three things that we had to know ahead of time, and we spent about 3 years developing this information to really help people understand and really set us up to have these deep, equitable conversations. The first thing we didn't know is what were the true source of emissions in Oakland. Greenhouse gas emissions inventories are done throughout the world. They follow a pretty standard methodology. And unfortunately, that methodology is not great at understanding your community's contribution to the global challenge. By that, I mean, cities tend to produce emissions inventories that draw a line around their boundaries and count up the emissions that happen within them. So the tailpipe emissions from your car driving in Oakland would be in our emissions inventory. Except that doesn't take into account the emissions associated with building that car, with shipping that car from its point of origin over to where it was sold. The gasoline that went into that car, how it was pulled out of the ground as a fossil fuel, refined, moved over by pipeline, moved over by boat again, put in a different pipeline. There are so many emissions that occur outside of the city of Oakland. So the city of Oakland and a few other cities now do what are called consumption inventories, which include the rest of those emissions. Tends to be about 2/3 of our emissions profile happens outside of the city of Oakland. So we started by doing analysis of both of those to better understand our emissions. Second, we wanted to understand how much everything actually cost. And that's what you see on the slide in front of you is we did a model with Bloomberg Associates in the city of Oakland, which looked at what are the most cost-effective ways to deal with the emissions that we do generate in Oakland. From that, we ended up with 5 priorities. This analysis is really, really deep and wonky. I encourage you to come to the City of Oakland website and download the report if you want to get the nitty-gritty on this, or we can get into it in the Q&A. But we essentially mapped out technology adoption, changes in transportation network companies, how people might get around and how they might operate in buildings differently over time. We put all those things together with the changing costs of technology across different market sectors and came up with essentially 5 priorities that we need to do for the GHG side of things. This doesn't address the equity at all. It only says what needs to happen differently, not how it should happen. So you see the 5 priorities: decarbonizing our grid, eliminating fossil fuel from building heating systems, improving building insulation and windows. Those 2 are essentially telling you the same thing. Gas usage is the big issue in buildings, and space heating in a climate like Oakland's and a building stock like Oakland's is actually more important than water heating systems. Moving away from private automobile trips and electrifying all the vehicles on the road. Pretty simple to say, but they're all really expensive versions to do too. So I said we had 3 things we had to do. One was understand our emissions profile better than the normal approach. 2, understand how much things cost, what are cost effective. And 3, how we would actually pay for any of that. So what you don't see up here on the slide is also that we did a finance map for all of the climate actions in the last plan. That was 175 actions in our previous cap. And we identified more than 60 funding sources, and it cost them upwards of $280 million to implement that plan. But knowing that would have made a big difference to those policymakers in deciding which actions to include and which ones didn't, when some actions were $110 million over the course of 10 years and other actions cost a few $1,000s. Knowing the relative benefit and value of those things would have been really important. This new plan does that. So all of that is to say, those were the things that we put together ahead of time. Those are all the information we had available that we used to go out to our community so that we could then say, we have a pretty clear idea of what needs to be done. What we lack is an understanding of how to do it in the most equitable ways. How do we do it that benefits your community? How do we do this in a way that protects the interests of people of color? How do we do this in a way that doesn't give more advantage to those with greater education, those with greater technological savvy, those with more access to the political system, and other forms of discrimination that have created the inequities that we have today within Oakland? So let's go on to the next slide. Now that allowed us to do a few different things within our planning process. The first thing that we did was look at traditional climate action plans are divided into the sectors that are there. So buildings, transportation, waste systems, things like this. We have that within our plan as well, but there are many things that don't fit neatly within those compartments. And what we heard from our community, one of the first things in structuring the plan in ways that are more understandable was looking at what we were calling intersectional priorities. These are cross-cutting topics that relate very specifically to how to create equitable strategies. Civic engagement is an example of these. Housing security is a great example. It's not a building energy policy that creates housing security. It's whether or not you're building units at scale that address the different affordability gaps, whether renewable energy and energy storage can be included within those other developments, whether transit friendliness is truly resulting in increased access for folks, and whether housing security, whether housing has the ability to withstand the shocks and stresses that we know exist in a place like Oakland. That includes not only things like earthquake and wildfire, but also public safety power shutoffs and sea level rise and changing precipitation patterns. And now we're seeing economic shocks from the current COVID crisis. It's a great example of whether or not housing security really exists in Oakland and where the gaps lie, where they're greatest. So we also identified public health, green jobs, resilience, food, and environmental justice as topics that exist throughout the plan. We dealt with these separately from the individual sections to show just how the climate priorities truly were potential equity solutions for things. Let's go on to the next slide. So embedding in the plan, 2 months ago, I would have given a very different version of this slide and what this looks like within a climate action plan. Because COVID-19 has created a unique circumstance, not just for Oakland. The situation exists for everybody, but what I think is unique is the opportunity for those of us in the climate field who feel like the broader society hasn't always embraced the changes that need to happen to get to the outcomes that Joanna described early on, the founding principles for these groups within there. Climate scientists and climate advocates have been feeling this for a very long time, that there just simply isn't the mass public organization around the needs that, that must happen in our society to get to equitable climate justice. Well, the COVID crisis has everybody thinking along the same lenses. The same lens is generally regarding public health right now, but public health has solutions that fit the climate crisis very, very well. I say that not to say that the climate crisis and COVID are related, but that the solutions very much can be. And one of the fortunate things about the strategy that Oakland used wasn't intentional. We didn't foresee this coming, but we did have a huge public health focus within our planning process because so many of the drivers of the climate crisis, things like inequitable transportation patterns and over-reliance on single occupant vehicles, the prevalent use of natural gas for space heating and water heating systems, also create a lot of public health impacts. NOx emissions from natural gas systems in indoor air quality, for instance, large drivers of exacerbated respiratory issues, the exact same things that COVID is dealing with. A lot of the external transportation is dealing with PM 2.5 emissions for greenhouse gases, in addition to some of the same health contributors in outdoor air quality for communities concerned like West Oakland, which has asthma hospitalization rates about 10 times the national average and has an average life expectancy about 15 years shorter than 3 miles inland. So this gives you an idea of the neighborhood you're born in Oakland can shorten your life by 15 years. That was happening before COVID. COVID is creating its own series of inequities, but the solutions to these can address both of those outcomes at once. So when we decided to embed health and these other intersectional priorities within the plan, we did this in a couple of very intentional ways. And this is what I'm hoping we'll be able to delve into in the Q&A a bit. For folks, as you hear this, I really want to hear where you think this, this approach can succeed, where it failed, where some more versions of its next iteration might go. We started with procedural equity. There are a lot of focus on equity outcomes, ensuring that people have equal access to the programs, ensuring that funding for, say, incentives to buy down the cost of installing a heat pump water heater, that those go to disadvantaged communities first. Those are great. Those are necessary. Those are entirely distributional. They don't address the procedural outcomes, which is, did the people affected by this actually be involved in the process of creating that policy? Was that incentive the most important thing to them? These are the things we started with. The first bullet point here, iterative drafting with an equity facilitator. We had two forms of community input that drove most of the engagement in our plan. The first was an equity facilitator. This was led by the Oakland Climate Action Coalition and Environmental Justice Solutions, two local place-based nonprofits in Oakland focused on environmental justice. They designed the outreach program for our plan. No one on city staff did this. These were done by folks embedded within the community who told us what type of meetings to have, how many meetings to have, what to provide at those meetings, how to frame the information. They insisted upon childcare and food at every meeting to ensure that people without access to those wouldn't be left out of the process. They came up with a notion of creating neighborhood cohort leaders, essentially non-climate folks within neighborhoods that would be compensated to learn about climate issues and talk to their neighbors in other forums about it to increase the access we had to people who wouldn't normally engage in these type of issues. Also, we had a community advisory committee that had both racial and gender balance across Oakland to deal with some of the issues of broader expertise. So we looked for transportation and energy and waste experts who were embedded within the community, but who also looked and had the educational backgrounds of our community. These two things helped ensure that we didn't get too far down a path that technically may have been the right thing to do for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but left out some local priorities. I'll give you a great example of how this played out in the plan. Transit is one of the main drivers of how we get to more equitable transportation system within this. We started with the notion of free transit for all. What if we simply figured out a way to buy down the cost of getting on BART and buses for every resident of Oakland? We then ran into the conversation, well, should it be every resident of Oakland? Should it only be those below a certain income level? Should it only be those in certain neighborhoods where lack of access has created its own set of issues? From a technical perspective, we thought, let's just go big and let's go for free transit for all. In the course of working with the equity facilitator and that community advisory committee, in fact, the feedback we got from that is that's not the community preferred approach. What we heard were far more concerns with safety of people riding on the buses in particular in certain neighborhoods at certain times of day. We heard about reliability issues with the bus service. We heard about the lack of routes within the areas where people needed to go as the primary issues. For instance, we learned that kids in one particular high school could not participate in the after-school programs if they were transit dependent because the last bus left the school route at 3:40 p.m. So none of the extracurricular activities in the afternoons and evenings were available to those people because they simply couldn't have gotten home afterwards. Those are the issues that turned out to be of greater importance to the community as we dove into the issues. So a lot of our action items ended up changing in ways that we as technical experts didn't quite envision. because we just simply don't have the on-the-ground knowledge of the lived experience that so many others in our process were able to bring to this. It deeply improved the planning process, it deeply improved the outcomes, and we saw this across impacts from sea level rise, to transit issues, to building retrofits. Really, I can't think of a single policy that wasn't touched by this approach in a meaningful way that improved the outcomes. We also had oversight from our Department of Race and Equity. Oakland is fortunate to be one of the cities that has such a department, and we have staff there that focused on a variety of ways for us to not only improve the procedural and distributional equity of what went into the plan, but also of providing us with, I would say, more objective analysis. For instance, they came up with a tool for doing a racial equity impact analysis across our plan. So once our 40 action items in the ECAP were developed, our equity facilitator conducted a racial equity impact analysis of each of the actions to identify where we had designed them well, where we had the potential for inequitable distribution and implementation over time, and how these things would work together with the key performance indicators for the plan, so that we would know really what we could do better over time, what our priorities should be on implementation, and we could show everybody that the government of Oakland does not deserve your trust, but we are doing our best, and here's how we can stand behind what we've done. Here's how we can prove to people that what we're doing is really going to change things. Our plan is data-driven. As I mentioned, there isn't this divide that I hear among a lot of cities on whether or not you focus on the deepest cost-effective greenhouse gas reductions or you focus on equity. It doesn't have to be both. I think the Oakland strategy shows that you can start from a data perspective and end with an equity perspective. And you can do this in a way that, that doesn't require you to balance the priorities of your community with the priorities of your planet. These things shouldn't be pitted against each other, and I hope that our strategy is one of many that finds a locally acceptable version for how we get there. So I've limited the slides to this. This is the last slide today. I wanted to make sure to leave a lot of time for Q&A, because I think more of the benefit comes from discussion of these items within there. I just hope this has provided a general overview of what our Equitable Climate Action Plan includes. It's modeled to get us to about 60% greenhouse gas emissions reductions from our baseline year of 2005. 60% is not good enough. It is ambitious. It's one of the deeper goals that we have among cities in California. It doesn't go far enough, but we think it sets us up for a lot of success and hopefully moving on forward, not only within Oakland, but in those who use our plan to come up with bigger and better and bolder ideas to follow. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Joanna for our next segment.
All right, thanks, Daniel. That's it. Thank you so much for explaining that. It's so thoughtful and intersectional. And I know when I saw some of the pictures, like of the little kid with the asthma inhaler, just like, oh, this is very serious. But I am curious, how will this plan actually get used? Is it aspirational? Is it enforceable? Why should people believe this plan will actually get implemented? And I know this isn't your first plan, so how does that compare to your last plan?
Yeah, the enforceability of these plans really does vary from city to city, especially as you get out of California on this stuff. Our plan will be adopted by our city council as an enforceable document. So it will carry the strength of policy. We will be able to mandate changes in development, changes in how our capital improvements are funded. It will be enforceable in a number of ways. That being said, government plans are only as enforceable as the staff who are there to make sure they get done. I think our current federal structure shows us that, in fact, many of the adopted policies of generations past are not being implemented. Not that they've gone away, there's just simply nobody there to force their hand on these things. So within a city like Oakland, I think that there's two parts to it. One, there is a strong commitment within city leadership. There has been for several generations. I've been in my position since 2014, but there has been some form of sustainability director in Oakland since the late 1990s. So before we even had the Urban Environmental Accords, before we had the Kyoto Protocols, Oakland was focused on this. It is a local priority and it's taken seriously within the government. That part helps. But Oakland not only is the progressive place that has focused on these things, Oakland also was the place where the Black Panthers were formed in the 70s because of the intense inequities associated with the policing system. in Oakland. Oakland is also the land use authority that permitted 3 freeways, the 5th largest port in the United States, and a regional wastewater treatment plant to all go around one neighborhood of primarily Black and brown people. Oakland has its own horrid history of treating people unfairly by race, by income, by gender, and all of these things contribute to the perception of Oakland as a government. There is no reason that the community of Oakland or the community outside of Oakland who lives, works, or plays within Oakland should have trust and faith that that will happen on its own. So I think this is where we need to, as government, we need to be able to provide more accountability to all of those folks about what we're doing. We need to provide feedback and be honest about that, not try to greenwash our own results, but actually give an honest impression of where we're succeeding, where we're failing, and how people can stay involved. But also, we have a really intensely involved community of folks on the climate side of things who thankfully are very vocal. They come to our city council, they come to our planning commission, they show up and they make known their priorities, whether they're consistent with the plan, whether they're independent of the plan, whether they're even climate focused or simply an area where climate has an impact. I think that part of whether this plan succeeds or fails will be how well those groups come together and unify around implementation. If those folks are fighting amongst themselves and amongst us about what our priorities should be or how much equity went into the creation of the plan, we're going to get a lot less done. This process was designed to try to bring us together, bring us closer for the next 10 years of implementation, but the proof will be in the implementation. Will this work? Will we be able to truly align on this? If we do, I think we'll get further, but time will tell.
Okay. So you just talked so much about the community involvement that has happened to date, and it sounds like you're almost done with the process and then it will get adopted and then comes implementation. For the people who are on this call, if they have not, or this video, if they have not yet been involved in this process and they live in Oakland or they work in Oakland, or maybe if they live in nearby communities, is there space for them to get involved? How can they get involved? What's the most constructive way for people to get their voice heard?
For those of you who have been involved, thank you. We appreciate it. And there were several thousand people involved in this process so far within Oakland. We had a very robust involvement among folks in our workshops, our town halls, our digital engagement, and so on. The plan is still going to go towards City Council, and I will work with both of the organizing groups here today to make sure that notices go out to these groups about when it's going to be heard so that you can come and be involved in the adoption process itself. But the adoption of the plan is as much as a policy wonk like me cares about getting the plan past City Council because it matters for sure. Really what matters is implementation. What matters is getting involved in building decarbonization. Matters is helping to transform curb space within Oakland. I'll give a great example of this one. We have the need for resilience hubs throughout Oakland. We need there to be distributed ways for folks to get access to resources, whether it's about power in the case of a power shutoff, whether it's about a place to go during smoke days when wildfire season comes upon us, which is getting very close, whether it's about having opportunities to lower the carbon footprint of the grid. There are a lot of neighborhood-based needs. Designing these is not going to be something that I need to be involved in. It's not what Daniel thinks is the right thing. It's what the people using that center think are the right thing. We're having conversations for probably 4 or 5 of these centers across Oakland right now. Every one of them differs. Some people want it more focused on, like I said, around power issues. Some people want it focused more on recreation issues. The idea that kids need safe places to play within the neighborhood. They need community gathering spots where they can talk about issues. Others are focused on people who may have medical dependent equipment. So they want there to be more scaled solutions for maybe isolation, which fits with COVID. All of these things are based on what people in the community really value. People in that neighborhood, people in that service territory. It may be education based, it may be professional based, it may be personal, it may be about seniors' needs, it may be about kids' needs. There are ways to get involved in a lot of neighborhood specific stuff, and we've designed the CAP to be primarily a neighborhood driven plan. The idea being that climate solutions, you said in my introduction there, bringing solutions to scale. The irony of scaling solutions is that the more local you start, the more scalable it is. The idea being people will have far more ownership and attachment to the solutions if they're part of creating them. And people can create far more effectively at the local level. So my advice to everybody on this line is find out who at your neighborhood really is making those decisions. Get involved at that level, and then keep going up as you feel comfortable. The citywide stuff works for some. For some in this group, since you're all involved in this professionally on this, you may be more interested in the advocacy sections of our plan, which go up to the regional, state, national, and international level. If you're focused on transportation, for instance, there's a lot of potential stimulus dollars on rethinking curb space. The idea being right now, if you try to park in front of a curb in Oakland, odds are what you're going to find is some vehicle parked there for a resident who lives above a business, and you're going to find an Uber or Lyft double parked in front of it, dropping somebody off and blocking traffic. That is not an efficient design for curb space at all. What if the curbs weren't there for parking at all? What if the curbs were there for shared mobility? What if the priority was how people got into the cars and whether they worked together, as opposed to what the vehicle was doing, whether it was commercial or residential or personal? There are questions out there, there's technology out there that can help us rethink the way all the urban infrastructure works, and transportation is a great example of one where we have no idea how people really want to best use that infrastructure. Helping to lead those conversations is going to create some amazing jobs that have huge impact for people, and I'd imagine there's a lot of folks on this call who would like to have those jobs, and I think there's a lot of people on this call who probably could do those jobs really, really well. So when you want to get involved in Oakland's climate action stuff, read our plan. Hopefully you'll like stuff, and hopefully you'll want to get involved in some of the actions. But I think the best thing you can do is help drive the narrative of what things can be. That's what our plan tries to focus on, is what are scalable solutions that reflect neighborhood priorities in equity-driven ways that rethink the way we've designed things inequitably. We've come up with some vision, but our vision is very, very adaptable. It's adaptable because we don't know the answers to things. The answers are going to come from the people in those communities. The more you can bring those voices to light, the more you can help refine them in ways that are actionable. Those are the things that I think are going to truly make a difference.
All right, thanks, Daniel. I want one of those spiffy transportation thinking the future jobs. That sounds great. But we also have a lot of energy wonks on the call as well from young professionals in energy. And so I want to ask about E BCE, which is my CCA too, so I should know what it stands for. East Bay Clean Energy, Community Energy?
Community.
Community. And what is the relationship between the city and E BCE? How do you work together? Are you kind of in separate spheres? How does that work?
Sure. East Bay Community Energy is a community choice aggregator. California, the Bay Area has 6 of these, covering almost all of the Bay Area at this point. California is not the only state to have them. Wasn't the first state that created them either. This is one where we're actually following some of the other states. But it is a joint powers authority, so it is actually an agreement of different governments. In the case of E BCE, it is 13 cities and a county that all work together to procure energy. So normally this is done by an investor-owned utility. They buy the electricity, and then they also transmit and distribute that electricity through their poles and wires. We took that procurement authority away from them. That's what CCAs do. And we gave it to ourselves. So we buy the electricity that goes into the poles and wires of PG&E, our investor-owned utility. So the city is one of the members. Our council members rotate through as part of the board of directors, as each of the cities and county do. Within that, our council member, Dan Kolb, happens to be the chair of East Bay Community Energy right now. And our staff work very closely with them on everything from program design to risk management to priorities on how they spend their time and money. As a CCA, they're part of, they're an independent agency in that they have their own board of directors, but that board is simply made up of elected officials from the cities. So the alignment there is pretty natural. We've seen, at least with East Bay Community Energy, they have hired up a fantastic list of talent from around the region for folks working on these programs. They are some of the best minds in energy, and they're thinking very creatively about transportation systems, about electrification for building energy systems, so natural gas to electricity systems. They're thinking about non-traditional fuels. They're thinking about what their role for hydrogen might be, for example. There's a lot of opportunity to work with them. We work closely with them on transportation and buildings. I sit on several of their committees, including risk oversight, which for all of you energy nerds out there, we get to pour through the day ahead and week ahead and 30-day ahead contracts in NP15 and get to figure out marginal pricing. It's so much fun. If you've ever wanted to be an energy procurement person, CCAs are definitely one of the best opportunities for you to do so. You can do it without necessarily having to work for an investor-owned utility, which creates its own set of ethical challenges for some within there. You can play in the power world without working on that side of things. But East Bay Community Energy is a huge part of the city's first bullet point in our CURB analysis, decarbonizing the grid. The renewable portfolio standard of the state is PG&E's stated desire to get to. East Bay Community Energy started on day one, more than doubling the RPS goal for 2030. So they were way ahead. 85% carbon-free electricity is the baseline product provided by E BCE. The city of Oakland opted up to 100% carbon-free electricity starting in 2018. So all of the city facilities are provided with carbon-free electricity and have been since then. E BCE offers a number of products, but they've made a commitment that they're gonna get to 100% carbon-free electricity for all of its customers within the next probably 5 to 7 years. We gave them up to 2030 in our model, but I'm expecting it's going to happen probably by 2025 at the latest. That's the kind of leadership that the CCAs have shown, and that E BCE in particular has definitely come through on for us.
All right, thanks. So I want to make sure we leave some time for Q&A. So maybe, Zach, if you wouldn't mind loading my slide. I had a question when I was thinking about what we could be talking about on this in this discussion. I went to my favorite local government climate policy tool, which is hosted by the Air Resources Board and developed by some UC Berkeley researchers. And they do a per household based analysis of consumption-based greenhouse gas emissions. And then they looked at the amount of greenhouse gas reduction potential in 2030 that's under the control in some way of local governments or can be influenced by local policies. And they did that actually for every zip code and every city in California. So even if you don't live in Oakland, you can go check them out and see how your zip code stacks up. But for Oakland, you can see by far the largest potential lies in urban infill. And I know you mentioned housing security before as a key cross-sectional issue. Obviously a huge amount of overlap with our housing affordability crisis, as well as the urbanist movement for more walkable and vibrant cities. So I'm curious, in what ways are you addressing infill specifically as a sustainability issue in Oakland?
Sure. The urban infill has a huge component to play. There's no doubt about this, and the Climate Action Plan includes strategies on promoting densification, prioritizing developments, specifically affordable housing developments around transit-friendly sites. But more than 85% of our development is already occurring in that fashion within Oakland. Oakland has more BART stops than any other city. Oakland has a very robust bus system. As mentioned earlier, it has some issues that can improve ridership for sure within there. But Oakland's growth is primarily happening in urban infill areas, and our planning strategies are largely designed around that. The ECAP really cements the climate importance of such a thing and looks at urban infill has the potential for reducing greenhouse gas emissions when seen from certain lenses. Cool California is a good example of this. Chris Jones, the primary author of this, we've worked with him over the years. When I mentioned the consumption emissions inventory, the Cool California network calculators are based on exactly the same principle. We use different methodologies. Cool California uses an economic input-output model that largely makes it income-based. We'd love to have more local data to find out where that's true, because I don't think all spending decisions are made by how much money you have. And I think that you run into some equity concerns when you base things primarily on economic data. And this is the area where we've really tried to articulate within the plan where you have GHG reduction potential, as you see in a slide like this, with where there are true equity needs. Urban infill is a great example of this. Urban infill can be a powerful driver for reducing emissions. It can also be a powerful driver for gentrification and displacement. Mm-hmm. How you do urban infill matters more than if you're doing urban infill in there. So the densities we're trying to get to, yes, we want to create the opportunity for more people to live closer to where they work. But what if it's San Franciscans coming in to live in the Oakland infill, forcing Oakland workers farther out into other areas? What if the density that we choose creates a lack of recreational opportunities for the folks that are there? In other words, what if we don't balance the need for the transportation infrastructure for micromobility, for walking and biking, for other forms of mobility other than a single occupant vehicle? What if we don't plan that in accordance? That's the kind of thing that the climate strategy really focuses on. I don't disagree with anything in this slide, and it's great to show that things like infill carry potentially more impact than something like VMT reduction. That's great, but again, we feel pretty confident in the technical know-how of what needs to be done. The how is really where equity comes into it. And that's the part that I think our process is really designed to help emphasize. It's amazing the work that climate scientists have put out there for this. I feel like it's only choosing between great options at this point for what data sources you use, whether it's things like the slide here, whether it's the curve model, whether it's great work put out by a number of different organizations on these things. The question is, I think for other cities and for folks on this call, is what ways you saw Oakland's approach. We didn't have as many meetings as we would have liked to have. We didn't get to as many people as we wanted to get to. We weren't clear about what the rubric would be for deciding between equity priorities. So what happens if multiple groups are disadvantaged? What happens if you create benefits for one disadvantaged group but challenges for another? Do you still pursue it if one group is more disadvantaged than another? There's really, really complex questions within this that aren't easy to answer. Not having them be easy to answer is not a reason to not act, though. So as many negatives as I threw in that sentence, we still have to create solutions that at least try things. We're getting further in Oakland with this, but I think that there's going to be a lot of different versions that work over time. I think there's going to be variations within Oakland that are going to be more effective, and hopefully we're going to learn about those over time. And I really want to hear from folks on this call, folks within Oakland, about where they see that working, where they see it not working, and help expand our thinking on this. Because, as a 44-year-old white male, I am about the least trusted person on equity issues in Oakland. And that is a fair starting point for residents in my community to make within there. I shouldn't be the voice of equity, but it is my responsibility, as it is for all other white males, to be able to speak knowledgeably on these issues and to make sure we do our parts to recognize the positionality that allows us the benefit to speak in forums like this, and to make sure that the perspective we bring to it highlights the people that truly need it most. That's what we're trying to do in our process, but I still think we have a long way to go. We may be farther ahead than a lot of cities, but we're nowhere close to achieving the type of equitable communities that we know we need to have.
Great. Yes. And on behalf of urban environmentalists, we are definitely also very conscious of the equity concerns. And if there are any ways that we can work with you on having sensitive and thoughtful ways to be promoting more urbanist environments that really bring everybody along and work for everybody, we're always down for working together constructively. So let's move on to something else that has been in the news every second, which is COVID-19 and your Car-Free Streets program. Can you tell us more about that program and any other activities you've done to help bring sustainability into your COVID response?
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. Slow Streets Oakland was a program we launched in early April. We took about 74 miles of our residential streets. This is about 10% of the street network in Oakland, and closed it to through traffic. It is a voluntary program. The police aren't out blocking off streets and barricading things and tracking down those who come through with their car, because folks on the streets still may be emergency workers. They may need to get there. We're not going to go out and give permits and badges to everybody and decide who does and who doesn't get to drive. But it is a way of testing at a pretty big scale. And the idea that streets should be given over to more active recreational uses, and to see how people will respond. It's a voluntary system, but still one with a lot of messaging behind it. And I think we're generating a lot of good data on that. It's still too early to say what that data is going to look like, but we are tracking how people are using the streets. We're getting what they're going to do. I've seen howling parties. I've seen singing parties. Seen lots of bike and scootering stuff for kids. Seen communal sing-alongs. There are so many ways that people are finding to creatively use that infrastructure. And I think what we're learning is that people within a lot of these neighborhoods, not all, but people within a lot of these neighborhoods are finding new and better ways to feel connected to their community with less traffic. And we expected that would be the case, but whether that's sustainable in the long term is still an open question. Whether it works within different neighborhoods with different cultural expectations is still an open question that we don't have nearly enough data to resolve within there. But to me, it's an exciting opportunity for us to try new things that put different priorities at the front. As you described earlier, the way we've designed cities was largely around the car and around the needs of the wealthier people. What happens if we rethink that? This is a way to rethink that. It may not be the best way, it may not be the second best way, but it is a way. So let's try it now while we can and find out what happens. We've been trying it a number of different ways. The Slow Streets program is the one that's gotten the most news coverage, and that's fantastic. But within the city's responses to things, cities are facing a huge budget shortfall as a result of lost tax revenues from this. Oakland is no exception to this. I'd say Oakland's probably somewhere in the middle of the impacted cities within this. Those that base their budgets on property taxes are more secure than the rest. Those who base their income on sales taxes or tourism are the ones most hit by this. So I would say it's not exciting or sexy, but probably the best thing we've been able to do is we've been able to protect the programs that are there related to climate that are already moving with things like incentives for energy efficiency appliances, with the planning for resilience hubs in East Oakland, Fruitvale, and West Oakland, with ongoing construction through East Oakland, which are some of the most disproportionately affected neighborhoods for lack of transit access and for poor air quality. We've been able to keep a number of things moving despite these budget cutbacks. That's probably the main priority for the next couple of years, just during the storm. I hope we can find more creative ways, and we're working with folks like East Bay Community Energy on what that might look like, who's been providing stimulus dollars to those doing air quality and health issues related to climate. So we've seen micro grants going out from E BCE as a great example of this. We are continuing some of those, but mostly at this point, it's understanding that while climate isn't the driver of the COVID crisis or even related to it, the solutions absolutely can be related to one another. So it's finding ways to empower climate-friendly solutions to the daily crises that people are facing with housing insecurity, with food insecurity, with healthcare insecurity. These are the things most on people's mind. Our climate solutions, in the immediate term, need to be just focused on climate-friendly ways to address those.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Well, it's heartening to hear that programs are still going forward, even in these crazy times. So I'm going to ask a question. We'll move into the Q&A portion now. And if you have any questions, just make sure to put them in the chat window and I'll collect them. So this one is from Angie, who says, hello, I'm wondering if you can also speak to the adaptation planning efforts that are on the horizon. One, will equity be integrated throughout the adaptation and resilience planning effort in a similar way? And two, Adapt, the regional adaptation initiative, just kicked off, and she's curious how or if the city will participate.
Great question. Thank you, Angie. Yes, the adaptation planning efforts will be integrated. Adaptation and resilience have their own sections within our climate action strategy. And the city also has an entirely separate resilience program. So we have a chief resilience officer, we have a resilient Oakland playbook, we have a preliminary resilience assessment. We have a lot of resilience work already in place in addition to the CAP. The CAP builds on the work already done there. But yes, the equity lens, both on procedural and distributional equity, absolutely applies to that. We can get into the details of what that looks like, but it's a range of providing enhanced security to folks to make everybody able to stay rooted in their community through the shocks and stresses that exist, whether they're climate related or whether climate simply impacts others. These relate to a lot of the things like natural gas. Great example of this, natural gas in homes is a huge fire risk in the case of an earthquake. For Loma Prieta, about half of the fires that started after that 1989 earthquake were from ruptured gas lines. We know that there's potential for that in a lot of Oakland for that. So eliminating natural gas from homes not only lowers the carbon emissions from those as we get to electric technologies, but can also make the homes more resilient. If we pair them with energy storage, then we can also potentially prepare for things like public safety power shutoff events. So there's these things layer onto each other. The equitable version of that is, of course, prioritizing those who are least able to do it on their own. hillside communities tend to be more affluent within Oakland than flatland communities. So if folks up there have the resources to do a solar plus storage event with decarbonization on their homes, we're going to clap, we're going to pat them on the back and tell them they're doing a great job, but we're not going to be investing program dollars in helping them do that. We're going to be looking for ways we can do that in West Oakland, in Fruitvale, in East Oakland, in Deep East Oakland, in Castlemont, in the neighborhoods where there are a lot more struggles, a lot less access to capital, and a lot more need for the technical guidance. That's where all of our resilience hubs are right now. And we've worked with East Bay Community Energy to identify where we have critical facilities that might best serve communities who don't have access to it now, largely based on economic and racial data. And that gives us another prioritization tool to show how we can apply these lenses in implementation through things like resilience hubs. So we have this for all of our actions in there. Just wanted to give one concrete example so you could see what it would look like. As for Bay Adapt, the Regional Adaptation Initiative, there's actually a number of these going on. BayCan is the one most involved for governments. That's the Bay Area Climate Adaptation Network. That's been run out of the state for, I think, about 3 or 4 years now that it's been active. And so we've worked with the state through that. There's also a regional initiative through the San Francisco Estuary Institute and the Bay Conservation and Development Commission, BCDC. They have an Adapting to Rising Tides regional program, which looks at sea level rise in the Bay Area. We participate in a number of these. How the city will participate in any one is a pretty iterative decision. It's really based on which programs are going within them, who has better access to funding, which cities are more involved. If an initiative ends up being more South Bay focused, we may step back. If it ends up being more aligned with some of the equity issues, even if it's Bay Area wide, we may be more involved. So these programs are still relatively new. They all change over time as they find their sea legs and sort of become who they're going to be. That's usually how we decide which of the programs to give more of our time to.
Makes sense. You mentioned some of those, the wealthy neighborhoods in the hills. On that topic, I have a question from Zach, who says, what about upzoning the wealthy single-family neighborhoods in Oakland? They still have lower emissions per household than the outer suburbs.
Yes, they do. That's one of the better parts of Chris Jones' Cool California network stuff, is they've done analysis of comparing those neighborhoods to each other, of looking at building net zero energy out in the suburbs as opposed to standard development and within communities. And it's exactly right that the overall consumption emissions are lower at standard construction and infill than they are in very green construction and outlying areas. So there's a huge need to bring more people in, and there's a strong equity concern with the land use development patterns in some of the upland communities within there. The ECAP has a number of different ways to address that. One of them is graduated density zoning. This is if you have any wonky planners within there, this is a planning concept that the density of any particular area shouldn't be based on traditional zoning patterns, but rather should be based on what's around you. If you are, for instance, if you're going from a 25-story hospital facility on Pill Hill, Kaiser, Sutter, these buildings on there, and you go right down to a single family house next door, which happens next to all of those hospitals within there, that is probably an inappropriate use. Even if, it's surrounded on the other side by residential, you should have stepped down buildings of greater height next to those buildings, and then smaller height, and then smaller height. You should scale down over time. That would create infill opportunities in places where it's most applicable. And that includes a lot of the upland areas where we have commercial development in the hillside areas already. We could zone up for that. Accessory dwelling units is another option available there, and it's one where our leadership in Oakland has pushed pretty hard to make ADUs available. They're already available by state law in any single family zone, but the ability to actually put them there in space-constrained hillside areas requires some creativity and spirit for what those development standards look like and how you bring them about. Also with subdividing homes, we have a lot of homes in Oakland that were single family that have been divided into a lot of different units. Sometimes they've done that with permits, sometimes they've done that without permits. As we try to get into some of these homes to create some of the equity needs for decarbonization, for instance, a lot of those folks are afraid to come forward and apply for the building permits to do that because their homes have been illegally divided. Crossing that barrier is one of the ways that we can get more density into these areas too, by finding ways to grandfather these in or doing virtual permitting that doesn't expose some of the unpermitted work that may be going on there. These are some of the creative ideas that have been thrown out there that are built into the plan. But Zach's main question about upzoning in there, I think densification throughout the city needs to happen. We are a fully developed community. We are built out in that there's not a lot of vacant land left, but that doesn't mean that we lack opportunities for growth and infill. But doing those in transit-friendly areas are the biggest driver for getting people out of their cars within there. The upland areas lack access to transit in most of our community. The transit tends to flow most freely in the flatlands. So that's an area where we're balancing, like I said, competing priorities. Densification shouldn't come at the cost just of existing residents of the flatlands that may make less money than the hillside areas. So it shouldn't be their burden to bear, but at the same time, will densification in the hills drive more people to own cars and be driving them up and down the hillside roads, increasing emissions? Those are the questions we have to balance against each other. I don't think there's an objectively right or wrong answer to that. There's just a, how do you balance the equity concerns against each other, and how do you make an informed prioritization? That's hopefully the conversation that comes from the way we've structured things in the plan.
Yeah, tough trade-offs. So let's move on to a question from Katarina. She has two questions. One is, I'd love to hear how equity will be included in the implementation of the plan. You mentioned a little bit of an example with the ADUs. And separately, what steps has Oakland taken, if any, to make their path replicable for other cities?
Okay, the first one, we have, within the plan structure itself, we have introductory language to describe the scale and scope of the problem, in addition to its equity issues. We have the action items themselves, and then we have a section that describes what's going to go into implementation of those. So we try to describe within them what equity will look like in the plan text. We also have a standalone racial equity impact analysis that goes through action item by action item what equitable implementation will look like within those, as well as metrics by which you could evaluate that. So we'll have this separate document to show that from an equity perspective. So if equity is the real reason you're asking the question, we'll have a standalone document that looks specifically at the racial equity side of things. It doesn't look at the economic equity, doesn't look at some of the gender equity issues. So there are other ways to look at it, other considerations that will go into implementation. But this one gives a pretty good dive in the racial side of things, which, you know, like I said, given Oakland's history with inequitable policing in the past, with land use decisions in primarily African-American and Latino neighborhoods, race is rightfully in place one. We still look at other forms of it, but race is the primary driver of equity issues. So we'll have that as a standalone document, but an example of what this will look like in there, we have, I'd say, a huge number of issues related to waste. Waste is a personal passion of mine within this. It comes out in things like the consumption analysis, where we see the profile of the goods and services that we consume, where they come from, what their emissions profiles are, where we start to see a huge amount of waste that creates greenhouse gas emissions, but we also start to see a huge amount of inequity. So there is a state law in California, SB 1383, that came out of Ricardo Lara in 2015, and that requires us to greatly increase diversion of organics from the waste stream. Now, this is good because organic material breaks down in the landfill primarily as methane, and methane directly released into the atmosphere is about 85 times as potent as carbon dioxide. Math that is traditionally poorly done by the IPCC and others who look at things only on the 100-year time scale, which isn't very useful for a methane molecule that breaks down in the atmosphere in 9 years. It dilutes its impact 10 times when you stretch it out over a 100-year time frame, when it's not there 91 of those years. So from a greenhouse gas perspective, that bill is important. But that bill is also important because it doesn't just say, take food out of the landfill and put it in a composting facility. It actually says, take food out of the waste stream, and first and foremost, take the edible food that's in that system and give it to hungry people. This is not a concept that should be difficult for anybody to get behind. The idea that we have 1 in 5 residents of Alameda County using our food bank, and we have 1 in 3 that are food insecure to some degree. We have a huge outstanding need, and we're talking about whether or not to compost or landfill our waste. We're having the wrong conversation. The right conversation, a common sense version of this, is let's build the infrastructure to get food from conference centers. Let's get the 30,000 wasted sandwiches from one day of the Dreamforce conference in San Francisco. Let's find a way to get those sandwiches to hungry people sitting right outside of that building who don't have access to it. You know, the Tenderloin in San Francisco is one of the most food insecure neighborhoods anywhere in the world. And yet here it is right there next to a very affluent place of affluent people wasting a huge amount of food. I'm not picking on San Francisco or the Moscone Center here. This happens all over Oakland as well. But we have to find ways to build this infrastructure in. Dealing with food insecurity allows people who are on the margins of being able to survive in Oakland to have more money available for the rest of their priorities, whether it's their kids' school or reliable transportation or making rent or emergency medical bills or any other priority they have. So you'll see our plan has a lot of versions of this where the bigger social need is not the climate need, it's hungry people. If we can't help address hungry people, we're not really part of the solution. Let's find the climate-friendly way, and that's addressing food waste, not because of composting or landfill, but because of the fact that we have edible food, we can help design that system. Oh, and by the way, if we have the food, we can give it to people who are hungry, and then if we can't, or what's left over, then we can ensure that goes into organics composting so that we can, you know, reduce emissions through sequestration.
All right. On that note, we are at time. Thank you so much, Daniel, for joining us. I learned a ton. I hope everybody else learned a ton. I'm sure they did. And for anyone who would like to attend more of our Urban Environmentalists events, we have meetings the first Monday evening of every month. And so stay tuned. You'll get an email in the newsletter. And of course, Young Professionals and Energy has a whole bunch of events lined up as well. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy your day.
Thanks, everybody.